The metallic clang of trays and the boisterous chatter of Belmont Academy's lunchroom pressed in on Jonathan J.J. Ellington. It was only his third day, and the cathedral-like space, with its vaulted ceilings and stained-glass windows depicting scenes of supposed enlightenment, felt less like a dining hall and more like a gladiatorial arena. He picked at the overcooked pasta on his plate, the aroma of garlic and oregano doing little to appease the gnawing unease in his stomach. He'd hoped the whispers would stop. He'd hoped the stares wouldn't burn quite so intensely. He'd hoped, foolishly, that the sheer imposing weight of his father's name, his father's success, would somehow shield him. He'd been wrong. 2 tables over, Tyler Whitman, quarterback and all-around golden boy, leaned inconspiratorially to Jackson Reynolds, his ever-present shadow. JJ recognized the shift in the room's energy, the subtle hush that preceded a spectacle. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was the spectacle. He kept his gaze fixed on his plate, on the swirling patterns of the marinara sauce, a desperate attempt to disappear into the mundane. He could hear them, though, their voices laced with a venom that belied their preppy smiles and perfectly coiffed hair. Think money makes you untouchable, huh? Tyler's voice, just loud enough to carry, was a barb aimed directly at JJ's back. JJ's jaw tightened. He gripped his fork, the metal cold against his skin. Ignore it, he told himself. Just ignore it. He'd perfected the art of invisibility, of shrinking himself to fit the spaces they deemed acceptable. It was a survival tactic he'd learned young, a shield against the casual cruelties of the world. Should have stayed at whatever public school crawled out of. Jackson's sneering laughter followed, punctuated by the approving snickers of their entourage. The words, "Go back where you came from," hung in the air, unspoken but heavily implied. JJ felt a burning shame creep up his neck, a familiar heat that he'd come to associate with moments like these. He focused on his breathing, trying to slow the pounding in his chest. "They don't know you," he thought, the words a fragile defense against the rising tide of anger. They don't know anything. He knew his father's influence had secured his place at Belmont. He knew some whispered about it behind their hands. He knew the whispers morphed into something ugly, something accusatory. He was an interloper, a trespasser in their hallowed halls. He pushed the pasta around his plate, the appetite he'd had completely gone. The irony wasn't lost on him. His father, Derek Ellington, a titan of the tech industry, a man whose name graced magazine covers and whose philanthropic efforts were lauded in newspapers, had sent him here, to this bastion of privilege, believing it would offer him opportunities, connections, a future. Instead, it felt like a gilded cage, a constant reminder of the chasm that separated him from the world he was supposed to inhabit. Later that evening, the tension hung heavy in the Ellington household. JJ retreated to his room, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of his fingers on his phone screen. He scrolled aimlessly through social media, a meaningless distraction from the churning emotions within. He hadn't told his parents about the lunchroom incident. Not yet. He knew his mother, Renee, would be heartbroken, her gentle nature ill-equipped to handle the ugliness he'd encountered. And his father, JJ, wasn't sure how his father would react. There was a steeliness to Derek Ellington, a quiet intensity that both awed and intimidated him. He'd seen glimpses of it, flashes of a righteous anger that simmered beneath the surface of his composed demeanor. He'd witnessed it in boardrooms, in negotiations, but rarely directed at him. The thought of unleashing that fury, of being the cause of it, filled him with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. He heard a soft knock on his door. JJ, his mother's voice, laced with concern, filtered through the wood. "Dinner's ready. Your father's home." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the inevitable questions. He plastered a smile on his face, a mask he'd become adept at wearing. "Coming, Mom." Downstairs, the dining room, usually a haven of warmth and laughter, felt stiff and formal. His father sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Renee, ever the peacemaker, tried to fill the silence with cheerful chatter about her day, but the words felt hollow, bouncing off the walls of their unspoken anxieties. "How was school, son?" Derek's voice, deep and resonant, cut through the pretense. JJ hesitated, the lie forming on his lips. "Fine," he mumbled, avoiding his father's gaze. Derek's eyes, sharp and perceptive, narrowed. "Fine," he repeated, the single word heavy with skepticism. Renee placed a comforting hand on JJ's arm. "Jonathan," she said softly, "your father and I are here for you. If something's bothering you, please tell us." He looked from his mother's worried face to his father's unwavering stare. He knew he couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. The dam of his carefully constructed composure threatened to break. He took a shaky breath and, in a voice barely above a whisper, recounted the events of the lunchroom. He described the whispers, the slurs, the feeling of being hunted, of being prey in a world that was supposed to be his. As he spoke, he watched his father's face. The initial shock gave way to a hardening, a tightening of the muscles around his jaw. A flicker of something dark, something primal, flashed in his eyes. It was the look of a lion protecting its cub, and in that moment, JJ knew that everything was about to change. The pristine white hallways of Belmont Academy echoed with the muffled tap of polished loafers and the hushed murmur of privileged voices. Jonathan Ellington, JJ to everyone who knew him, walked with his head down, the weight of unspoken words pressing on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd learned to navigate these halls like a shadow, a phantom flitting through the periphery, hoping not to be noticed. Each day was a tightrope walk, a delicate balance of invisibility and forced normalcy. He concentrated on the rhythmic click of his own footsteps, a small, steady beat against the rising tide of anxiety in his chest. It was a rhythm he desperately clung to, a reminder of his own presence in a space that seemed determined to erase him. The whispers started subtly, like the rustle of dry leaves in a desolate wind. "Affirmative action," one boy muttered as JJ passed. Another snickered. "Must be nice to buy your way in." JJ's jaw tightened, a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He fixed his gaze on the polished floor, willing himself to become transparent, to disappear into the gleaming marble. "Kill him with kindness, baby," his mother's voice echoed in his head. "Rise above it." He'd heard the words so often they'd become a mantra, a shield against the insidious barbs. But each time, the shield felt a little thinner, the mantra a little less potent. The pranks escalated slowly, almost imperceptibly. His locker, once a sterile space of textbooks and neatly arranged notebooks, became a repository of garbage crumpled papers, half-eaten food, the lingering stench of sour milk. He'd clean it out each morning, his stomach churning with a mixture of disgust and resignation, then find it defiled again by the end of the day. He told himself it was just boys being boys, harmless pranks, a twisted form of camaraderie. But the casual cruelty in their eyes, the smug satisfaction in their laughter, told a different story. He could almost feel their gazes on his back, burning into his skin like a brand. Ignore it, he told himself, it'll stop eventually. But a cold, hard knot of fear had begun to take root in his heart, whispering doubts he couldn't quite silence. One afternoon, in the crowded cafeteria, his tray was accidentally knocked from his hands, sending a cascade of spaghetti and meatballs splattering across his shirt. The laughter that erupted was a physical force, a wave of derision washing over him. He stood there, frozen, the sticky sauce clinging to his skin like a second layer of shame. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the prickle of tears at the corners of his eyes. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them understand the weight of their casual cruelty. But the fear held him captive, the fear of confirming their prejudices, of proving them right. He grabbed some napkins, his hands trembling, and began to wipe the mess, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, humiliation, anger, and a deep, gnawing sense of loneliness. That evening, at the dinner table, his father, Derek Ellington, a man whose presence commanded attention, noticed the subtle shift in JJ's demeanor. The usual easy banter, the animated discussions about school and friends, were replaced by a quiet reserve, a withdrawn silence that hung heavy in the air. Derek watched his son, his sharp gaze missing nothing: the slumped shoulders, the downcast eyes, the forced smile that didn't quite reach them. A flicker of concern, a ghost of his own past experiences, danced in his eyes. "Everything all right, son?" he asked, his voice laced with a gentle concern that belied his usual commanding tone. "Fine, Dad," JJ mumbled, pushing the food around his plate. Renee, JJ's mother, a woman whose warmth radiated through the room like sunshine, reached out and touched his hand. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice filled with maternal concern, "talk to us. Something's bothering you." JJ hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He wanted to tell them, to share the burden of his daily torment. But the fear of disappointing them, of shattering their carefully constructed world of privilege and success, held him back. He shook his head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, Mom. Just tired." Derek's gaze remained fixed on his son, his intuition screaming that something was wrong. He knew the subtle signs, the unspoken language of pain, the masks we were to protect ourselves and those we love. He remembered his own struggles, the battles he'd fought, the indignities he'd endured. A fierce protectiveness, a primal urge to shield his son from the same pain, surged within him. He decided to wait, to let JJ come to him when he was ready. But the seed of unease had been planted, and it would grow slowly and steadily, until it could no longer be contained. The next morning, JJ opened his locker to find a single sheet of paper taped to the inside. 3 words, scrawled in crude block letters, stared back at him. "You'll never belong here." The air rushed out of his lungs as if he'd been punched in the gut. The casual cruelty, the whispers, the pranks, they were no longer just childish antics. This was a declaration of war, a blatant assertion of his otherness, a stark reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be an outsider. He crumpled the note in his hand, the paper crinkling like a dry leaf, the sound echoing the shattering of his carefully constructed facade of resilience. He closed his locker, the metallic clang reverberating through the silent hallway, a final, definitive sound. He leaned his head against the cool metal, closing his eyes, trying to control the trembling that racked his body. The knot of fear in his chest had blossomed into a full-blown panic. He wasn't just invisible, he was a target. He walked through the rest of the day in a daze, the words, "You'll never belong here," echoing in his mind, a constant, insidious reminder of his isolation. He saw the smirks, the knowing glances, the barely concealed whispers. They knew. They'd always known. And they were making damn sure he knew it too. He didn't go to class. He didn't eat lunch. He simply wandered the halls, a ghost in his own life. That evening, he walked into the house, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His father, sitting in his study, looked up as JJ entered. He saw the devastation in his son's eyes, the raw pain etched on his face. He didn't need words. He knew, and in that moment, something inside Derek Ellington snapped. The passive observer, the patient father, was gone, replaced by a fierce protector, a warrior ready to defend his own. The fight had begun. The stale air hung heavy in the history classroom, thick with the dust of forgotten eras. Jonathan J.J. Ellington traced the worn grain of the wooden desk with his fingertip, the smooth surface a stark contrast to the churning discomfort in his stomach. Mr. Henderson droned on about the Reconstruction era, his voice a monotonous wave washing over rows of politely disinterested faces. JJ tried to focus, tried to absorb the historical narrative of struggle and resilience, but the words seemed to echo hollowly against a backdrop of whispered jokes and rustling papers. He felt a familiar prickle of unease, a constant companion in these hallowed halls of Belmont Academy. And of course, Mr. Henderson continued, adjusting his glasses with a weary sigh, the legacy of slavery continues to impact our society today. JJ's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him. The subtle shift in the classroom atmosphere, the sudden hush, spoke volumes more than any textbook ever could. He hated these moments, these forced confrontations with his own identity, laid bare under the clinical gaze of academia. He just wanted to be JJ, not a representative of a painful past. He longed for the simplicity of anonymity, a luxury seemingly denied to him within these ivy-covered walls. "Now, class," Mr. Henderson's voice broke the tense silence. "Can anyone tell me about the significance of the 14th Amendment?" A hand shot up. Tyler Whitman, his blonde hair perfectly styled, a smirk playing on his lips. JJ's stomach clenched. He knew that look. He knew the tone that would follow. It gave citizenship to like everyone, right? Tyler's voice dripped with faux innocence. Even he paused, his gaze lingering on JJ. People who used to pick cotton. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. JJ felt his face burn. The carefully constructed wall of indifference he'd built around himself began to crumble. He stared down at his hands, the knuckles white against the dark wood of the desk. His internal monologue screamed, a chaotic jumble of anger and humiliation. He wanted to lash out, to shout, to make them understand the casual cruelty of their words. But the years of ingrained self-preservation, the constant reminder of his father's mantra, "Rise above," kept him silent. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to quell the storm brewing inside. Then Jackson Reynolds, Tyler's ever-present shadow, chimed in. JJ should answer that. Bet his grandpa was in the fields. The laughter intensified. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, a weak gesture of reprimand that held no real weight. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, "let's keep our comments relevant to the discussion." Relevant. The word echoed in JJ's mind, a bitter mockery of the blatant disregard for his feelings. This wasn't a discussion. It was a public dissection of his heritage, a casual reminder of his place in their world. He glanced at Mr. Henderson, hoping for a sliver of genuine concern, a flicker of understanding in the teacher's eyes. But all he saw was a practiced neutrality, a carefully crafted mask of professional detachment. The message was clear. This was just another classroom disruption, a minor inconvenience to be swept under the rug. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the snickers and whispers, trying to transport himself anywhere but here. He imagined his mother's warm embrace, her gentle voice soothing his frayed nerves. He thought of his father, the quiet strength in his eyes, the unwavering belief in his son's potential. Their love was a shield, a constant reminder of his own worth. But even that shield felt thin and fragile in this moment, barely able to withstand the barrage of prejudice he faced daily. The bell finally rang, a jarring sound that sliced through the tense atmosphere. JJ gathered his books, his movements stiff and robotic. He avoided eye contact with everyone, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the classroom. As he walked out the door, he could still hear Tyler's voice, laced with mocking laughter. "See you later, field hand." The words hit JJ like a physical blow. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. The carefully constructed wall of indifference had completely shattered. He was no longer trying to fit in. He was no longer trying to rise above. He was angry. He was tired. And he was done. He knew he couldn't keep silent any longer. He had to tell his father. He had to let someone know the truth about what was happening behind the gilded gates of Belmont Academy. The thought of confronting his father, of admitting his vulnerability, filled him with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He knew his father wouldn't stand for this. He just hoped it wasn't too late. The fluorescent lights of Belmont Academy's hallway hummed, a dull, incessant drone that mirrored the low thrum of anxiety in Jonathan Ellington's chest. He walked with his head down, the polished marble floor reflecting a distorted image of his face, a face he'd schooled into an expression of detached calm. He'd perfected this mask, this armor against the subtle, insidious jabs that came with being the only black student in his year. Each morning, he braced himself, anticipating the microaggressions, the barely concealed disdain, the casual erasure of his presence. He'd learned to navigate this minefield, to anticipate the explosions, to sidestep the shrapnel of prejudice. Today, however, the detonation was unavoidable. Jackson Reynolds, flanked by his usual posse, materialized in front of JJ, his smirk a practiced sneer. "Hey, Ellington," he drawled, the name dripping with a faux casualness that JJ knew masked something else, something sharper, more venomous. JJ's fingers curled slightly in his pockets. He knew this dance. He'd seen it before. Ignore, deflect, disappear. "Reynolds," JJ responded, his voice even, betraying none of the tension coiling within him. "Don't engage," he told himself. "Don't give them what they want." He tried to sidestep them, but Tyler Whitman, Jackson's shadow, shifted, effectively blocking his path. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. "Heard your dad's company's doing pretty well," Jackson continued, his tone laced with a false admiration that grated on JJ's nerves. He felt his jaw tighten, the urge to retort, to lash out, a burning ember in his throat. But he swallowed it down. "Stay calm," he repeated internally. "Don't react." "He works hard," JJ replied, the words clipped his voice tight. He could feel the weight of their gazes, dissecting him, searching for a crack in his composure. He knew what they wanted. They wanted to see him angry. They wanted to see him explode. They wanted the justification to label him as aggressive, as volatile, as the angry black kid. Jackson chuckled, a low, mocking sound that echoed in the sterile hallway. "Yeah, well, you know how it is these days. Lots of opportunities for people like your dad." The unspoken implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Affirmative action, the handout, the insidious suggestion that his father's success, built on years of relentless work and sacrifice, was somehow undeserved, a product of charity rather than merit. The ember in JJ's throat flared into a burning fire. He wanted to scream. He wanted to grab Jackson by the collar and shake him until he understood, until he saw the sheer audacity of his words. But he didn't. He couldn't. He forced himself to breathe, to maintain the carefully constructed facade of indifference. "My father built his company from the ground up," JJ said, his voice strained, each word a physical effort. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the telltale flush of anger he fought so hard to suppress. "Don't give them the satisfaction," he thought, the words a mantra against the rising tide of fury. Jackson's smirk widened. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, loud enough, however, for the small gathering of onlookers to hear. "JJ isn't like, a real Ellington. He's just lucky his dad got a handout." The words hit JJ like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It wasn't just the blatant racism, the casual cruelty. It was the implication, the insidious suggestion that he, Jonathan Ellington, didn't belong, that he was somehow less than a counterfeit version of his own family. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself, the layers of stoicism and indifference, crumbled under the weight of that single sentence. He saw a flicker of movement in the periphery, a flash of bright color. It was Sarah, her face a mixture of concern and anger. She started to move towards them, but JJ shook his head almost imperceptibly. He couldn't bear for her to be dragged into this, to become another target of their venom. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent hallway. The fire in his chest had died, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. He walked blindly, the faces of his classmates blurring into an indistinguishable mass. He could feel their eyes on him, curious, speculative, some even tinged with a hint of pity. He hated that pity more than the scorn. He reached the sanctuary of the library, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a soft thud, shutting out the noise, the stares, the suffocating weight of their prejudice. He sank into a chair in the far corner, the silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the image of Jackson's smirking face, the echo of his words reverberating in his mind. A handout. The phrase twisted in his gut, a bitter taste in his mouth. He thought of his father, of the countless hours he'd spent working, the sacrifices he'd made, the sheer force of will that had propelled him from a small, struggling startup to the helm of a multi-billion-dollar tech company. He thought of his mother, her unwavering support, her quiet strength, the bedrock of their family. And he thought of himself, caught in the crosshairs of a prejudice he hadn't asked for, a battle he never wanted to fight. He opened his eyes, the image of his reflection in the polished marble floor flashing in his mind. He saw not the distorted image, but the face of his father, the pride in his eyes, the unwavering belief in his son's potential. He saw his mother's gentle smile, her unwavering love a shield against the world's harshness. And he saw himself, no longer the boy trying to disappear, but the son of Derek Ellington, a man who had earned his success, a man who had taught him the meaning of resilience, a man who would not let his son be defined by the narrow-mindedness of others. The hollow ache in his chest began to fill with something else, something harder, something sharper. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. The muted glow of the laptop screen painted streaks across Jonathan's face, the reflected light catching the sheen of unshed tears. He stared blankly at the lines of code he'd been working on, the complex algorithms suddenly meaningless, foreign symbols in a language he no longer understood. Outside, the night pressed against his window, a suffocating darkness mirroring the one inside him. Belmont Academy. His father had called it an opportunity, a privilege. Jonathan just felt trapped. He'd spent the day navigating a minefield of microaggressions. A snide remark in history class about affirmative action. A locker mysteriously accidentally slammed into his shoulder in the crowded hallway. The way Tyler Whitman and his cronies, particularly the ever-present shadow of Jackson Reynolds, seemed to materialize wherever he went, their laughter following him like a malicious echo. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself it didn't matter, that their petty cruelty couldn't touch him. But the constant barrage chipped away at his resolve, leaving him raw and exposed. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to translate the turmoil in his mind into words. He opened a new message to Andre, his childhood friend, the one person who understood, who didn't need explanations. "How's Belmont?" Andre had texted earlier, the innocent question now a cruel irony. Jonathan stared at the blinking cursor, a digital heartbeat mocking his own faltering rhythm. He typed, deleted, typed again. What could he say? That the prestigious Belmont Academy was nothing more than a gilded cage, its bars forged from prejudice and indifference? That the weight of his father's expectations, the pressure to succeed, to prove he belonged, was crushing him? He closed his eyes, picturing his father's face, the pride in his eyes, the unwavering belief in his son's potential. Derek Ellington had clawed his way to the top, a black man in a white man's world. He'd fought his own battles, faced his own demons. How could Jonathan tell him that the very institution he'd sacrificed so much for was slowly suffocating his son? A sigh escaped Jonathan's lips, a sound heavy with the burden he carried. He typed a single word, "Fine." Then another, "Tired." He stared at the two words on the screen, two flimsy shields against the onslaught of his emotions. They felt inadequate, pathetic even. He deleted them, the click of the backspace key echoing in the quiet room. He rested his forehead against the cool metal of the laptop, the pressure a small comfort against the throbbing in his temples. The image of Tyler Whitman's sneering face flashed in his mind, the casual cruelty in his eyes. The memory of Jackson Reynolds' mocking laughter, the way he deliberately bumped into Jonathan, the muttered apology laced with sarcasm. The silence of the other students, their averted gazes, their complicity in the unspoken code of Belmont. It was a suffocating blanket of indifference, woven with threads of prejudice. He thought of his mother, her gentle touch, her unwavering support. She'd sensed his unease, the forced smiles, the carefully constructed facade of normalcy. "Talk to your father," she'd urged, her voice soft but firm. "He needs to know." But how could he burden her with his pain, add to the worry lines that already etched her face? He was supposed to be their strong son, the embodiment of their hopes and dreams. He couldn't let them down. A bitter laugh escaped his lips, the sound harsh and unfamiliar. Strong. He felt anything, but he felt like a fraud, a pretender in a world that didn't want him. He was tired of pretending, tired of the constant vigilance, the careful calibration of every word, every action, the exhausting effort of trying to fit into a space that was never meant for him. His fingers flew across the keyboard, the words pouring out of him, a torrent of suppressed emotions finally breaking free. "It's not fine, Andre," he typed, the words blurring through the tears that finally welled in his eyes. "It's not fine at all." He described the daily indignities, the subtle slights, the overt hostility. He poured out his frustration, his anger, his despair. He wrote about the pressure he felt, the weight of his father's legacy, the fear of disappointing him. The words tumbled onto the screen, a jumbled mess of raw emotion. He didn't censor himself, didn't try to polish the edges of his pain. He just let it flow, a cathartic release that left him trembling. And then he typed the words that he'd been holding back for so long, the words that had been festering inside him, poisoning his soul. "I hate it here." He stared at the words on the screen, their stark simplicity a stark contrast to the complex emotions they represented. A wave of exhaustion washed over him, leaving him drained and empty. He hit send, the click of the button a final, irrevocable act of defiance. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the laptop. He closed his eyes, the weight of his confession heavy on his chest. But amidst the exhaustion and despair, a flicker of something else ignited within him. A spark of defiance, a glimmer of hope. He had finally broken the silence. He had finally spoken his truth. And in that moment, he knew he was not alone. The aroma of rosemary and garlic drifted from the kitchen, a familiar comfort in the Ellington household. Tonight, it did little to soothe the tension tightening around Jonathan's shoulders. He picked at the roasted vegetables on his plate, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the grayness settling over his mood. He could feel his father's gaze, a weight that shifted between concern and scrutiny. Across the table, his mother's smile seemed strained, her eyes flitting between him and Derek. He wished, not for the first time, that he possessed the ability to become invisible, to melt into the polished mahogany of the dining table and escape the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. "Something on your mind, son?" Derek's voice, usually a comforting baritone, held a sharp edge. Jonathan flinched, the movement barely perceptible. "No, sir." He stabbed a carrot with unnecessary force. Underscore, why does he always have to see through me? Underscore, he knew his father possessed an uncanny ability to decipher his moods, a skill honed from years of navigating the cutthroat world of tech. A skill that, in this instance, felt more like an intrusion than a comfort. Renee reached across the table, her hand briefly covering his. "Jonathan." The single word was laced with a mother's gentle concern. He forced a smile, a pale imitation of genuine happiness. "Just tire, Ma." Derek's silence was more telling than any question. Jonathan could feel the unspoken pressure building, a silent demand for the truth. He hated this, hated the way his father's eyes could dissect him, peel back the layers of carefully constructed indifference he wore like armor. He'd hoped to keep it contained, this gnawing unease that had taken root in his stomach and spread like a creeping vine. He'd hoped to maintain the illusion of normalcy, of fitting in at Belmont, the prestigious academy his father had insisted upon. "Tired?" Derek echoed, the single word heavy with skepticism. He set down his cutlery, the clink against the china echoing in the sudden silence. "Or is it something else?" Jonathan swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult. He pushed the food around his plate, the rosemary-infused aroma suddenly cloying. Underscore, just leave it. Underscore, a voice whispered in his head. Underscore, don't stir things up. It's not worth it. Underscore, but his father's gaze, unwavering and intense, made it impossible to ignore. "It's nothing, Dad. Just school stuff," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "School stuff." Derek's voice was laced with a dry amusement that didn't reach his eyes. "Define school stuff, Jonathan." He could feel his mother's anxious gaze on him, a silent plea to just tell the truth. He took a deep breath, the scent of rosemary and garlic doing little to calm the turmoil churning inside him. Just some guys being jerks. You know how it is. Derek leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Jerks how, Jonathan? Be specific. The words tumbled out, a torrent of suppressed frustration. He told them about the snickers in the hallways, the accidental bumps in the crowded corridors, the whispers that followed him like shadows. He recounted the incident in the cafeteria, the spilled milk that had soaked his shirt, the laughter that had followed. He told them about being excluded from study groups, about his locker being mysteriously glued shut. He minimized it, of course, downplayed the sting of the words, the humiliation of the constant, subtle jabs. He didn't mention the casual racism that permeated the hallowed halls of Belmont, the insidious undercurrent of prejudice that seeped into every interaction. He didn't tell them about the gnawing fear that he would never truly belong, that he would always be an outsider, no matter how hard he tried to fit in. He didn't tell them how it felt to be constantly judged, not for who he was, but for the color of his skin. He couldn't. He didn't have the words. Derek listened, his face a mask of controlled fury. The silence that followed Jonathan's hesitant confession was thick with unspoken anger. Renee reached out, her hand resting on his arm, a silent offering of comfort. That's it. Derek's voice was deceptively calm. Jonathan nodded, relief coursing through him. It was over. He'd said enough, just enough to appease his father without revealing the true depth of his misery. You're leaving something out, Jonathan. His father's voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it held a steel-like quality that made Jonathan's stomach clench. He shook his head, a denial he knew was futile. He could see the flicker of disappointment in his mother's eyes. Underscore, why couldn't they just leave it? Underscore, he thought, a wave of resentment washing over him. Underscore, why did they have to dig? Underscore, Derek sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. Jonathan, he began, his voice laced with a patient exasperation. A few spilled milks and some jerks don't explain the way you've been withdrawn these past few weeks. Don't act like this doesn't bother you. I know you better than that. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles white as he clenched them in his lap. He wished he could disappear, fade into the background like a ghost. He hated the way his father could see through him, strip away his carefully constructed defenses. Then Renee spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Jonathan, honey, your father's right. There's something else. Tell us. He closed his eyes, the image flashing in his mind. The slur scrawled across his locker door in thick, black marker. The ugliness of the word, the hate it embodied, had burned itself into his memory. He'd scrubbed it off furiously, desperate to erase the stain, but it remained, etched into his mind, a constant reminder of his otherness. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally confess the truth, but the words caught in his throat. He shook his head, the shame burning in his chest. He couldn't say it, couldn't bring himself to utter the word, to give it voice, to acknowledge its power. It was nothing, he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Derek slammed his hand on the table, the force of the blow rattling the silverware. A slur on your locker isn't nothing, Jonathan. His voice was raw with anger, the controlled facade finally cracking. Don't you dare minimize this. Don't you dare pretend it doesn't matter. The air crackled with tension, the scent of rosemary and garlic forgotten. The muted hum of the city lights filtering through the panoramic window painted streaks across the polished mahogany of Derek Ellington's desk. He stared at the cityscape, a vast, impersonal tapestry of twinkling lights and imposing shadows, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. His son's face, young and troubled, haunted the edges of his vision. JJ's usual bright, inquisitive eyes had been shadowed, his smile extinguished. He tried to offer advice, the kind of tough love wisdom his own father had instilled in him. Fight back, son, he'd said, the words echoing in the silent expanse of the office now, hollow and insufficient. Renee's voice, soft yet firm, cut through his thoughts. You were too hard on him, Derek. She stood by the window, her silhouette etched against the city's glow. He could sense her disapproval, a subtle tightness in her shoulders, the slight furrow in her brow. He sighed, the weight of his own past settling heavily upon him. He knew what it meant to fight, to claw your way through prejudice and indifference. But was that the life he wanted for his son? He turned to face her, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, adding a layer of complexity to their usual intensity. I don't want him to be a victim, Renee. I want him to be strong. He ran a hand over his face, the fatigue of the day finally catching up to him. He'd spent the day fielding calls, managing his company, all the while a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The Belmont Academy, a place he'd chosen specifically for its supposed prestige and inclusivity, had become a battleground for his son. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Renee moved closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The warmth of her touch was a grounding force, a reminder of the love and stability he was fighting to protect. "He shouldn't have to fight like you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet the words resonated with a quiet power. He looked at her, truly looked at her, the worry etched in her beautiful face. He saw his own reflection in her eyes, the shared fear, the protective instinct that bound them together. He'd been so focused on equipping JJ for battle, he'd forgotten to acknowledge the wounds already inflicted. He'd been so intent on passing on his own hard-won resilience, he'd overlooked the simple truth JJ was not him. He was his own person, deserving of a different path, a path free from the constant struggle against ingrained prejudice. "I know," he admitted, the words heavy with the realization of his misstep. "I know I messed up." He closed his eyes briefly, the image of his son's downcast face flashing again behind his eyelids. The casual cruelty of the other boys, the whispers, the snickers, the blatant disregard, it was a pattern he knew all too well. He'd faced it, fought it, and ultimately transcended it. But that didn't mean his son had to endure the same ordeal. He opened his eyes, a new resolve hardening his gaze. He paced the length of the office, the silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the city outside. He thought of his own battles, the subtle slights, the overt racism he'd faced in his climb to success. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to push down the anger, to focus on his goals. But at what cost? He realized now that his silence, his internalization of the injustice, had only perpetuated the cycle. He'd become so accustomed to fighting his own battles, he hadn't considered that this was a different kind of war, one that required a different strategy. This wasn't about individual resilience, it was about systemic change. He stopped pacing, turning to face Renee. "This isn't just about JJ anymore," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is about every kid who walks those halls, every kid who feels like they don't belong." He felt a shift within him, a subtle yet profound transformation. The frustration, the anger he'd been holding on to, began to morph into something else, something more powerful. A determination to dismantle the very structures that allowed such prejudice to flourish. He wouldn't just teach his son to fight, he would fight alongside him. "I'm not going to let them get away with this," he continued, the city lights now reflecting a steely glint in his eyes. He thought of Principal Westbrook, the man who valued the school's reputation more than the well-being of its students. He thought of Tyler Whitman and Jackson Reynolds, the privileged boys who wielded their social standing like a weapon. He wouldn't just address the symptoms, he would target the root cause. He'd built his empire from the ground up, facing down challenges and overcoming obstacles. He would apply that same tenacity, that same unwavering focus to this fight. He would use his resources, his influence, his platform to expose the rot within Belmont Academy, to force them to confront the ugly truth they so desperately tried to conceal. Renee watched him, her eyes widening with understanding. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She'd seen this look before, the look of a man on a mission, a man who wouldn't back down until justice was served. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that things at Belmont Academy were about to change. The silence in the office stretched, thick with unspoken understanding, the city lights painting a backdrop of promise and potential. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in days, Derek felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light in the encroaching darkness. He wasn't just a father protecting his son. He was a warrior, ready to dismantle the systems that perpetuated injustice, brick by painful brick. The metallic tang of freshly cut grass hung in the air, a stark contrast to the knot tightening in Jonathan's stomach. He walked the pristine halls of Belmont Academy, the morning sun glinting off the polished floors, a mockery of the darkness that shadowed his every step. Each locker door seemed to stare back at him, cold and indifferent. He could almost hear the whispers, the snickers that followed him like a second skin. He stopped at his own locker, his fingers hovering over the combination dial. A strange premonition, a chilling certainty, held him back for a beat. He inhaled a slow, deliberate breath and yanked the door open. The air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of cheap spray paint and the weight of pure malice. The inside of his locker, once neatly organized, was now a canvas of hate. Racial slurs, crude drawings, all screaming at him in garish colors. His books, his carefully arranged notes, were defaced, ripped, and thrown haphazardly on the floor. The metallic tang of the grass was replaced by the bitter taste of bile rising in his throat. He heard the laughter before he saw them. Tyler Whitman and Jackson Reynolds, their faces contorted in cruel amusement, stood a few feet away, flanked by their usual entourage. Tyler's eyes met his, a spark of malicious triumph glinting in their depths. "What's wrong, Ellington?" he drawled, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Thought you'd like the attention." His words were like shards of glass, each syllable designed to cut. JJ's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white against the dark metal of the locker door. The blood pounded in his ears, a roaring symphony of rage. He wanted to lash out, to unleash the fury that burned within him. But something held him back. A cold, hard knot of resignation. He'd seen this play out before. The outburst, the inevitable detention, the condescending lectures from Principal Westbrook about appropriate behavior. What was the point? It wouldn't change anything. He closed his locker slowly, the metallic clang echoing in the suddenly silent hallway. He met Tyler's gaze, his own expression carefully blank. "You're right," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's attention, just not the kind you think." He turned and walked away, leaving the stunned silence behind him. Each step was a conscious effort, a battle against the urge to run, to disappear. He could feel their eyes on his back, burning into him. He walked towards the library, seeking refuge in the quiet rows of books, in the scent of old paper and ink. But even there, the silence was tainted. The images, the words, the laughter echoed in his mind. He sat at a table, his hands trembling slightly, and pulled out a textbook. The words blurred before his eyes, meaningless symbols on a page. He thought of his father, of the quiet strength he always exuded. He thought of his mother, of her gentle touch, her unwavering support. He wondered if he should tell them. Again, the last time, it had resulted in a meeting with Principal Westbrook, who had assured them that it was just boys being boys. He closed his eyes, the sting of humiliation fresh and raw. Back at home, that evening, the silence at the dinner table was heavy, suffocating. Renee looked at her son, her eyes filled with concern. "Jonathan, something's troubling you. Please talk to us." He looked at his mother, then at his father, Derek, who was studying him with a quiet intensity. He hesitated. He didn't want to burden them, didn't want to see the disappointment in their eyes. But the weight of it all was too much. He told them everything. The escalating harassment, the vandalized locker, the taunts, the indifference of the school administration. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, each word a testament to his exhaustion. Derek listened, his face impassive, but a storm was brewing beneath the surface. He had faced this kind of prejudice himself, growing up in a different time, a different place. He had fought his way to success, believing that his achievements would shield his son from the ugliness he had endured. He was wrong. The next morning, Derek Ellington walked into Belmont Academy, his presence commanding attention. He was a force of nature, his tailored suit and calm demeanor radiating power and authority. He went straight to Principal Westbrook's office, his stride purposeful, his eyes fixed ahead. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He laid out the facts, his voice low and controlled, each word a precise strike. He demanded action, not empty promises. He demanded justice for his son. Westbrook, flustered by Ellington's unexpected presence and forceful demeanor, stammered about school policies and investigations. But Derek wasn't listening. He had heard enough. He knew the language of institutional inaction. He knew the subtle ways in which prejudice was allowed to fester and grow. "My son will not be subjected to this abuse," he stated, his voice cutting through Westbrook's feeble excuses. "If you are unwilling or unable to address this issue, I will." He turned and left, leaving Westbrook speechless in his wake. The news of Derek Ellington's visit spread through the school like wildfire. Whispers followed JJ in the hallways, but this time they were different. There was a flicker of fear in the eyes of his tormentors, a hint of uncertainty. The power dynamic had shifted. They had underestimated Jonathan Ellington. They had underestimated his father. Later that day, a school-wide assembly was called. Derek Ellington stood on the stage, his presence filling the auditorium. He spoke about his son, about the pain he had endured. He spoke about the insidious nature of racism, about the responsibility of institutions to protect their students. He spoke about the consequences of inaction. His words were not angry, but they were powerful, resonant, and impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the assembly was thick with tension. Tyler and Jackson sat in the front row, their faces pale, their usual arrogance replaced by a nervous apprehension. They had never seen this side of Jonathan Ellington's father. They had never been held accountable for their actions. That night, at the dinner table, the silence was different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't suffocating. It was the silence of understanding, of shared strength, of quiet defiance. Jonathan looked at his father, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. He had finally found his voice, not through shouting or fighting, but through the quiet power of his father's unwavering support. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. He belonged. He was not alone. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Belmont Academy, gilding the imposing brick facade with a deceptive warmth. The air, still thick with the day's lingering heat, hummed with the low thrum of departing buses and the excited chatter of students released from their academic cages. Jonathan Gijay Ellington stood apart from the throng, his backpack slung low on his shoulders, a weight that mirrored the one in his chest. He watched the familiar ritual of goodbyes, the casual embraces and shared jokes, a world he remained on the periphery of. His fingers traced the outline of a faded graffiti mark on the brick wall, a small act of defiance against the suffocating normalcy of Belmont. He'd spent weeks trying to blend in, to become invisible against this backdrop of privilege, hoping that if he didn't make a ripple, the undercurrents of prejudice wouldn't pull him under. But the whispers, the snickers, the casual shoves in the hallways, they'd become a constant, corrosive presence, etching themselves onto his skin like acid. Today, it had been Tyler and Jackson, their taunts echoing in the crowded cafeteria, laced with a venom that chilled him to the bone. He'd wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to become one with the shadows. But a new kind of anger, a slow-burning ember, had begun to ignite within him. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wouldn't end. Not until something changed. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the distorted image of the school gates. JJ recognized the car instantly his father's. Derek Ellington stepped out, his tall frame radiating an aura of power and control. His tailored suit, a stark contrast to the casual attire of the other parents, seemed to draw the attention of everyone around. A knot tightened in JJ's stomach. He knew this wasn't a routine pickup. His mother, Renee, had been urging him to talk to his father, to let him know what was happening. JJ had resisted, clinging to a naive hope that he could handle it on his own, that he could somehow rise above it. But his mother's worried eyes, the tremor in her voice during their late-night phone calls, had betrayed his own carefully constructed facade of resilience. Now, Seeing his father here, a storm brewing in his usually calm eyes, JJ knew the dam had finally broken. Jonathan, his father's voice, usually warm and reassuring, held a steely edge. JJ walked towards him, each step heavy with a sense of foreboding. He saw a cluster of news vans parked further down the street, their satellite dishes glinting in the fading sunlight. Reporters, their faces eager, their cameras poised, were converging on the school entrance. A strange sense of detachment washed over JJ. It was as if he were watching a scene unfold in a movie, the reality of it not quite sinking in. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, the words catching in his throat. Derek's gaze swept over the assembled crowd, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I'm here to make sure this ends," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I'm here to make sure that no child has to endure what you've been through." He placed a hand on JJ's shoulder, the weight of it a tangible expression of his resolve. JJ looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw not just the successful CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, but a father, his face etched with a pain that mirrored his own. He remembered snippets of conversations overheard late at night, his mother's hushed tones, his father's weary sighs, allusions to a past he had never fully understood, a past marked by the same insidious prejudice that was now poisoning his own present. As Derek strode towards the school entrance, the reporters surged forward, their questions a cacophony of sound. JJ followed, his legs moving mechanically, his mind racing. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, a sense of inevitability that had been building for weeks finally reaching its crescendo. Principal Westbrook, his face pale and drawn, appeared at the entrance, flanked by two nervous-looking administrators. He tried to intercept Derek, his words a placating murmur, but Derek brushed past him, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the principal, beyond the ornate doors of Belmont Academy, to something deeper, something more profound. He stopped in the center of the courtyard, the setting sun casting his figure in sharp relief. The reporters pressed closer, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. The students who hadn't yet left lingered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. A hush fell over the crowd, a palpable anticipation hanging in the air. "I'm here." Derek's voice resonated across the courtyard, cutting through the silence, "because my son has been the target of repeated racial harassment. He has been subjected to taunts, insults, and threats, all because of the color of his skin." His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Principal Westbrook stammered a denial, but Derek raised a hand, silencing him. "Silence is complicity," he said, his voice rising in intensity. "For weeks, I have tried to address this issue privately, to work with the school to find a solution. But my pleas have been ignored. My son's suffering has been dismissed." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the students, the teachers, the administrators, each one bearing witness to his indictment. "This is not just about my son," he continued, his voice resonating with a deep-seated anger. "This is about the pervasive culture of racism that exists within these hallowed halls. It is about the failure of this institution to protect its students, to uphold the values it claims to represent." He turned to face the cameras, his eyes blazing. "I will not stand idly by while my son is subjected to this kind of abuse. I will not allow this school to continue to perpetuate this cycle of hate." JJ stood beside his father, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a surge of pride, a sense of empowerment he had never experienced before. He saw the faces of Tyler and Jackson in the crowd, their expressions shifting from amusement to unease, then to outright fear. He saw the other black students, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He saw the white students, many of them looking down, their faces flushed with shame. In that moment, the carefully constructed facade of Belmont Academy, its veneer of privilege and prestige, began to crumble, revealing the ugly truth beneath. The silence that had protected the perpetrators, the silence that had allowed the abuse to continue, had been broken. And in its place, a new sound emerged, a sound of defiance, a sound of hope, a sound of change. The sterile chill of Principal Westbrook's office seemed to seep into Jonathan's bones. A week had passed since the incident, a week of hushed whispers and sideways glances. He'd felt every stare like a pinprick, a constant reminder of his otherness in this hallowed hall of privilege. The plush leather chairs, the mahogany desk, the framed diplomas, they all felt like props in a play where he was cast as the unwelcome guest. He sat beside his father, the weight of expectation heavy in the air. Across from them, Tyler Whitman lounged with an affected nonchalance, a smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, Tyler's father, Mr. Whitman, exuded an air of irritated impatience. The man's tailored suit and perfectly coiffed hair screamed influence and power, the kind that could silence dissent with a single phone call. Jonathan caught his father's eye, a flicker of steel in his usually warm gaze. He won't let this go, Jonathan thought, a knot tightening in his stomach. He wasn't sure if he felt relieved or apprehensive. Principal Westbrook cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the tense silence. Well, gentlemen, I believe we're all here today to find a resolution. The words hung in the air, hollow and inadequate. Jonathan shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. A resolution? He thought, a bitter taste rising in his throat. As if a few forced apologies could erase the weeks, months, years off this. He glanced at Tyler, whose smirk had widened into something almost predatory. Tyler, Principal Westbrook prompted, his voice laced with a strained patience. Perhaps you'd like to start by offering Jonathan an apology. Tyler shifted, the smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before returning, bolder than before. Sure, he drawled, his eyes flicking dismissively over Jonathan. Sorry. The word landed like a lead weight, heavy with insincerity. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Sorry for what? He wanted to scream. Sorry for the relentless taunts? The casual racism disguised as jokes? The feeling of being constantly under siege? But the words remained trapped in his throat, a choked whisper of fury. His father, however, did not hesitate. Sorry for what? Derek's voice, usually smooth and controlled, now vibrated with a controlled fury that made Jonathan's heart pound. He straightened in his chair, every muscle taut. Be specific, Tyler. What exactly are you apologizing for? Tyler flushed, the smirk finally vanishing, replaced by a look of sullen defiance. He mumbled something unintelligible. Speak up, son, Mr. Whitman interjected, his tone sharp. He shot a warning glance at Tyler, then turned to Derek with a conciliatory smile. Derek, boys will be boys. A little harmless ribbing, harmless. Derek cut him off, his voice dangerously low. Calling my son racial slurs? Threatening him? Is that what you consider harmless, Mr. Whitman? The air crackled with tension. Principal Westbrook shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between the two men. Gentlemen, please, let's keep things civil. His words sounded weak, almost pleading. Derek ignored him, his eyes fixed on Mr. Whitman. This isn't about boys being boys. This is about the culture of racism that you and this institution perpetuate. This is about the fact that my son has been subjected to constant harassment, and you, he turned to Principal Westbrook, his voice rising, you have done absolutely nothing to stop it. Jonathan watched his father, a mixture of awe and fear churning within him. He'd rarely seen this side of his father, this raw, unleashed anger. He knew the source of it, the deep-seated resentment born from years of facing similar prejudice, a resentment he'd tried to shield his son from. But the shield had cracked, shattered by the reality of Belmont Academy. Principal Westbrook stammered, Mr. Ellington, we take these matters very seriously. We have a zero-tolerance policy for zero tolerance. Derek scoffed. Then explain why my son has been enduring this for months? Explain why the perpetrators are still walking these halls, while my son feels unsafe in his own school. You failed at your job, Principal Westbrook. You failed to protect my son. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations. Mr. Whitman's face was flushed, his conciliatory smile replaced by a mask of anger. Tyler stared at the floor, his earlier bravado gone. Principal Westbrook, caught in the crossfire, looked utterly defeated. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Jonathan, caught in the swirling currents of his father's anger and the school's complicity, felt a strange sense of detachment. He'd longed for this, for someone to see, to acknowledge the pain he'd been carrying. But now that it was happening, it felt hollow. An empty victory in a war that was far from over. He knew that this meeting, this forced apology, wouldn't magically erase the ingrained prejudice that permeated Belmont Academy. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was a crack in the foundation, a small opening for change. He glanced at his father, the lines of anger softening around his eyes. He saw the weariness, the years of battling injustice etched onto his face. And in that moment, Jonathan understood. This wasn't just about him. This was about all the JJs who had come before and all those who would come after. This was about breaking the cycle, one painful, necessary step at a time. The meeting ended with strained handshakes and hollow promises. As they walked out of the office, Jonathan felt his father's hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember glowing in the darkness. The panoramic view of the city glittered outside Derek Ellington's office window, a million tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. The city was his kingdom, built on lines of code and fueled by ambition. But tonight, the sprawling metropolis held no comfort. The reflected lights shimmered in the moisture that filmed his eyes. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly, a counterpoint to the silence that stretched between him and his son. Jonathan JJ sat perched on the edge of the leather sofa, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on the cityscape, as if searching for answers amongst the twinkling lights. Derek's heart ached. He'd built this empire, this life, to shield his son from the very thing that now shadowed him. He'd thought money, success, access, these were the weapons that would deflect the blows. He'd been wrong. So terribly wrong. So, Derek began, his voice rougher than he'd intended, we have options. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the burn a welcome distraction. He watched JJ from the corner of his eye, searching for a flicker of reaction, some sign of the thoughts churning beneath that carefully neutral expression. Nothing. The boy was a fortress. It was a strength, Derek knew, this stoicism, this ability to hold himself together under pressure. But it was also a wall, one that kept Derek out. JJ finally shifted, his gaze moving from the window to the glass in his father's hand. Like what? He asked, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. He didn't touch the soda his father had offered him. Derek swallowed, the scotch doing little to smooth the tightness in his throat. We could find another school. The words felt heavy, tainted with failure. He'd promised himself, promised his wife, that JJ would have everything he'd been denied. A childhood free from the constant sting of prejudice, free from a gnawing fear that came with being black in a world designed to hold you back. And now, here he was, suggesting retreat. Silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. Derek watched his son, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes, turning them into pools of shimmering uncertainty. A muscle twitched in JJ's jaw. Derek recognized it, the same tick he himself displayed when wrestling with a difficult decision. And what? JJ finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens when the same thing happens at the next school? Do we run again? The question hit Derek like a physical blow. He could see the flicker of anger, of hurt, finally breaking through JJ's carefully constructed composure. It was a righteous anger, a justified hurt. And Derek knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that running wasn't the answer. Running had never been the answer. He'd spent his own life running, trying to outrun the whispers, the stares, the casual cruelty. He'd built his success on the foundation of that flight, driven by the need to prove them wrong. But he'd never escaped, and he wouldn't condemn his son to the same fate. He set his glass down on the polished mahogany desk with a decisive click. The sound seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. You're right, Derek admitted, his voice low and steady. He met his son's gaze, holding it with a newfound resolve. Running solves nothing. It only empowers them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. If we leave, he continued, the words resonating with conviction. If I pull you out of Belmont, they win. JJ's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white against the dark leather of the sofa. Derek could almost hear the gears turning in his son's mind, the internal struggle playing out behind those guarded eyes. He'd always encouraged JJ to be strong, to be resilient, to rise above the pettiness of prejudice. But what he hadn't realized was that resilience could take many forms. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was refuse to run. They don't, JJ said, his voice low but steady, a steel core emerging from the quiet pain. They don't get to decide who I am. The words hung in the air, charged with a newfound strength, a defiant energy that resonated deep within Derek's chest. A slow smile spread across Derek's face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, chasing away the shadows of doubt and fear. No, he agreed, his voice filled with a quiet pride. They don't. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. So what do you want to do, son? JJ straightened, his posture no longer stiff but radiating a quiet confidence. He looked out at the glittering cityscape, the lights no longer symbols of an unattainable world, but rather a reflection of the fire that now burned within him. He took a deep breath and turned back to his father, his eyes clear and resolute. I want to stay, he said, the words ringing with a newfound clarity. I want to fight. He paused, his gaze hardening. And I want to win. The crisp autumn air, tinged with the scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke, did little to dispel the lingering tension at Belmont Academy. The echoes of Derek Ellington's words, sharp and accusatory, still reverberated through the hallowed halls. The silence that followed his public confrontation wasn't the comfortable quiet of discipline. It was the strained, uneasy hush of a secret unearthed. JJ walked the corridors, his shoulders a little straighter, his gaze a little more direct. The whispers that followed him now weren't entirely malicious. Some held a note of curiosity, others a flicker of something akin to respect. He had become, in a way, the unwilling epicenter of a seismic shift in the school's carefully constructed facade. He felt the weight of it, a heavy, uncomfortable mantle. Part of him yearned for the anonymity he'd craved before, the simple desire to blend into the background. Another part, a nascent, rebellious spark, felt a thrum of satisfaction. He'd broken something, shattered the illusion of polite indifference. The change was subtle, like the slow creep of dawn. Tyler and his cohort, Jackson Reynolds trailing behind like a loyal shadow, steered clear of him. Tyler's eyes, once filled with a casual disdain, now held a flicker of apprehension, a hint of something that might have been fear. JJ noted it, registered the shift in the power dynamic, but it didn't bring him the surge of triumph he might have expected. Instead, a hollow ache settled in his chest. Was this all it took? A public shaming, a threat to their privileged positions, to make them back down? The realization was both liberating and deeply unsettling. It exposed the fragile foundation of their supposed superiority. He found his mother's concern a constant presence, a warm hand on his shoulder, a gentle inquiry in her eyes every morning. He appreciated it, the quiet strength in her unwavering support. But he couldn't quite articulate the tangled emotions that churned within him. The shame of being singled out, the anger at the injustice, the weariness of being constantly on guard. He saw the worry etched on her face, the unspoken questions mirrored in his father's gaze. Their attempts at conversation felt stilted, burdened by the weight of unspoken words. How could he explain the subtle jabs, the microaggressions, the constant feeling of being an outsider looking in? How could he convey the insidious erosion of his self-worth, chip by chip, day after day? The faculty, too, seemed to move with a newfound cautiousness. Principal Westbrook, his face a carefully neutral mask, addressed the student body in a carefully worded assembly about respect and tolerance. The words, hollow and devoid of genuine conviction, bounced off the walls of the auditorium. JJ could almost feel the collective eye roll of the student body. He wondered if Westbrook even believed his own platitudes. The performative nature of the gesture felt like another layer of betrayal. He'd hoped, perhaps naively, for a genuine acknowledgement of the problem, a sincere effort to address the underlying rot. Instead, he got a carefully orchestrated performance designed to minimize damage and protect the school's reputation. Then, slowly, tentatively, cracks began to appear in the monolithic wall of silence. A girl from his history class, Sarah, someone he'd barely exchanged a word with, approached him in the library. Her voice, soft and hesitant, offered a simple, "I'm sorry about what happened." The words, though small, carried a weight of sincerity that surprised him. He mumbled a thank you, his heart thudding a strange, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He hadn't realized how much he'd craved that simple acknowledgement, that small gesture of solidarity. Another student, a boy from the debate team, publicly challenged Tyler's dismissive comments about the Black Student Union during a lunch break. The ensuing argument, though brief, was witnessed by a sizable crowd. The fact that anyone, was willing to speak up to challenge the status quo was a small victory. It was a ripple in the still waters, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, things were beginning to change. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of quiet victories and lingering unease. The overt bullying stopped. Tyler and Jackson, though still present, seemed to exist in a different orbit, their influence waning. JJ found himself the unexpected recipient of hesitant smiles, nods of acknowledgement, even a few genuine conversations. He was still an outsider, still marked by the color of his skin, but the invisible barrier that had separated him from the rest of the student body seemed to be slowly dissolving. But the quiet moments, the ones spent alone in his room, were filled with a lingering disquiet. The casual cruelty, the ingrained prejudice hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, morphing into something more insidious, more difficult to confront. The whispers still followed him, softer now, laced with a different kind of curiosity. He was no longer just J.J. Ellington, the scholarship kid. He was J.J. Ellington, the boy whose father had exposed the school's dirty laundry. The label, though unintended, felt like another form of confinement. He longed for the simple anonymity of being just another student, another face in the crowd. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the fight wasn't over. The battle lines had simply shifted. He was no longer fighting for acceptance, for place at the table. He was fighting for something more fundamental, something more profound. He was fighting for the right to simply be, to exist without explanation, without justification. And the weight of that fight, he realized, would be with him long after he left the hallowed halls of Belmont Academy. The silence after the storm was a peculiar thing. Not the peaceful, cleansing quiet that follows a summer rain, but a thick, suffocating blanket woven with unspoken words and averted gazes. Belmont Academy, a place that once whispered promises of prestige and legacy, now echoed with the ghosts of exposed truths. JJ sat in his room, the muted hum of the air conditioning a stark contrast to the roaring tempest that had recently ripped through the hallowed halls. His father's words, sharp and resonant, still vibrated in the air, a challenge thrown at the feet of an institution steeped in denial. He'd watched his father, a man who usually navigated the world with carefully measured steps, explode with a righteous fury that had shaken JJ to his core. The raw emotion in his father's voice, the way his eyes blazed with a fire JJ had rarely seen, it had exposed a depth of pain that transcended the current situation. It was the pain of a lifetime spent battling the insidious whispers of prejudice, the subtle slights and overt aggressions that chipped away at the soul. He'd seen it reflected in his mother's anxious gaze, the tight clench of her hand on his father's arm, a silent plea for him to temper his rage. He replayed the scene in his mind, each detail etched with agonizing clarity. Tyler's smug smirk fading into a mask of shock, Jackson's bravado melting into bewildered silence. Principal Westbrook's carefully constructed composure crumbling under the weight of Derek Ellington's accusations. The other students, some shifting uncomfortably, some staring in open-mouthed disbelief, all caught in the crossfire of a battle they hadn't realized was raging. He'd seen a flicker of fear in their eyes, a sudden understanding that the carefully constructed walls of privilege could be breached. The consequences had been swift and brutal. Tyler and Jackson suspended, a hollow victory that felt more like a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. The school's reputation tarnished, the whispers now louder than ever, but focused on the audacity of Derek Ellington's outburst, not the injustice that had fueled it. JJ knew, with a chilling certainty, that the real battle was far from over. The whispers in the hallways, the averted gazes, the subtle snubs, they were all symptoms of a deeper malaise, a disease that had infected the very foundations of the institution. He thought of his mother, her quiet strength a constant presence in his life. She had always encouraged him to speak up, to challenge injustice. But she also carried the weight of generations of women who had learned to navigate a world hostile to their existence. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the weariness in her eyes, and understood the toll this constant fight took. He closed his eyes, the memory of her hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance, a tangible reminder of the love that anchored him. The expulsion of Tyler and Jackson was a Pyrrhic victory. It changed nothing. It was a performance, a gesture designed to appease his father, to quell the rising tide of bad press. The rot remained. He felt a strange sense of detachment, like watching a play unfold on a distant stage. The actors went through their motions, delivering lines they'd rehearsed, but the underlying script remained unchanged. The school's response was a carefully crafted performance of contrition, a hollow gesture designed to protect its image, not address the underlying issues. It was a silencing tactic, a way to sweep the ugliness under the rug and pretend it didn't exist. He felt a cold anger hardening within him, a slow burn that replaced the initial shock and hurt. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the other JJs, the countless black students who navigated the treacherous waters of predominantly white institutions, constantly battling the subtle currents of racism. The ones who endured the microaggressions, the casual insults disguised as jokes, the constant pressure to prove their worth in a system designed to undermine them. The ones who learned to swallow their anger, to silence their voices, to become invisible in order to survive. He thought about the silence, the deafening silence of his classmates, the complicit silence of the administration, the suffocating silence of a society that refused to acknowledge the depth of the problem. He understood now that silence wasn't neutrality. Silence wasn't a passive act. Silence was a weapon, wielded by those who benefited from the status quo. It was a shield that protected the perpetrators and silenced the victims. It was a breeding ground for the insidious whispers of prejudice to grow and fester. The words echoed in his mind, a stark realization that struck him with the force of a physical blow. Silence isn't just complicity, it's permission. It was his father's voice, but it resonated with the voices of generations who had fought and died for the right to be heard. It was a call to action, a challenge to break the silence, to shatter the illusion of normalcy, to expose the ugliness that lurked beneath the surface. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. He wouldn't be silenced. He wouldn't be invisible. He wouldn't be complicit. He would speak. He would fight. He would be the voice for those who have been silenced for too long. He would be the change he wanted to see in the world. And maybe, just maybe, in the echoes of his voice, others would find the courage to speak their truth as well. The silence had to be broken. The truth had to be told. The fight had to be fought.